All right, so once again, I welcome all of you to the classes of art and culture part. So, as you remember, I had spoken with all of you a day before yesterday regarding the basic concepts of art and culture. All right, and then I discussed with you, in fact, how do we define the concepts like art, culture, civilization, etc. Fine. Now, in the context of that only, I was discussing with all of you the philosophical underpinning in the Indian art and culture, right from the ancient time, in fact. All right. And as I told you also, that the syllabus of the art and culture is quite holistic. It covers the episodes or the developments right from the ancient time to the modern era. So therefore, I mean, whatever that is in our surrounding related to art and culture can be asked as a question in the examination. That is actually the advantage with UPSC. Coming back to this show, so I was discussing with all of you the philosophical underpinnings basically, and there I did mention to all of you that how at different ages or different you can say periods, the philosophical underpinnings kept on changing in India, and because of that also it actually influenced every aspect of human life, including the art and culture. Fine. So in the context of that only, we have to now today, of course, improve our interaction from here onwards. So let me now share with you the uh, the slide that we were discussing. In fact, so I discussed with you about these all aspects in the last class itself. All right. And if you remember, I had mentioned about that particular question also, which we have had a discussion. In fact, now you can see on your screen. So this is what actually we were discussing in the last class, and there we actually stopped. So again, I'm repeating what actually was the idea regarding this particular slide. So see, I mentioned to all of you that at different phases of time, different kind of philosophical outlook was there among the human beings, and that was also depicted in some of the other form of art and culture. So, for example, I told you about the Indus Valley civilization. I also told you about the Vedic period, where we had discussed, rather, I have explained to you that in the Vedic period also there were various kinds of philosophies that actually emerged. All right, and those philosophies itself were the most important instruments of the art form at that particular point of time. And in fact, those philosophies can also be seen in the context of the you can say the tangible art forms, especially like let's say stupas, chaityas, viharas, even in those construct in those monuments, in those buildings constructions also, the philosophy was quite influential. And I told you about even in the 6th century BCE onwards, the idea of Buddhism and Jainism was equally very much, you can say, important, in fact, and it was also influencing, or also influencing every form of art and culture in India. Fine. So there I also explained to you that in the 6th century BC onwards, in fact, the emergence of the six school of philosophies took place, and those six school of philosophies also have had a wider impact upon the human mindsets, and it is still can be seen in the current surrounding, in the current scenario as well, that the philosophies which was there in the Vedic period and continued till the end of the Vedas. For example, Vedanta was also one of the philosophies which I discussed also with you in my last class. All right. So, such kind of philosophies remain so impactful that even in today's context, people are there who actually have been following these philosophies. For example, you can see on the screen the philosophies like Sankhya was given by Kapil, Yoga was given by Patanjali, Nyaya was given by Gautam. All right. Vaisesika was given by Kannad, in fact. All right. And Kannad was also associated with Prashast Pad, another philosopher of Vaisesika school of thinking. So this is the same Vaisesika school of thinking which actually had given the concept of atom. So people say that atom bombs, which actually had got developed in the modern era, they derive its philosophy from Vaisesika school of philosophy. So you can see Vaisesika school of philosophy was also there in the 6th century BC onwards. Mimamsa was there, of course, by Jaimini, all right. And then Vedanta was also there, of course, of Sankaracharya. Fine. So these schools of philosophies didn't emerge at one particular phase of time. In fact, the idea is from 6th century BC onwards till 8th century CE, this school of philosophies kept on evolving. So in entire ancient period of India, there were major six school of philosophies apart from the other schools of philosophies, especially I'm talking about Buddhism and Jainism. Fine. So besides Buddhism and Jainism, these six school of philosophies remained a dominant schools of philosophies, and they emerged from 6th century BCE onwards, and in fact they kept on evolving at different phase of time uh, by different, let's say, scholars till 8th century CE. For example, Sankaracharya. The Sankaracharya's philosophy of Advaitwad, all right, it was actually the end of Vedanta was the philosophy of Sankaracharya, that is the end of the Veda. In fact, Upanishads and the writings of Upanishads, the message of Upanishads, the knowledge of Upanishads are still very much relevant because Upanishads do not support the idea of orthodoxy. Upanishads support the idea of rationality. All right, so idea of rationality, and most importantly, Upanishads also do not support the rituals which were so essential in the Brahmanical religion earlier. All right. So Upanishads even do not support the rituals. Upanishads even do not support those all orthodox practices in your belief system, in your religion, etc. So Upanishads happen to be the one of the most relevant philosophies uh, in the early, I would say, the late ancient time or early medieval time as well, and it continued till in the current context also. That is how we see the relevance of Vedanta school of philosophy even today. And leave that, why not we can talk about yoga. So yoga still is not only a school of philosophy which has become a normal course of action of every human being in today's life. Rather, it actually has acquired the international significance also, the global significance also. So yoga is another very great, you can say, school of philosophy which emerged in ancient India, and I mean, by today, it has acquired a shape of a global concept. All right. So that is how you can see the significance of the Indian philosophies for the entire world. Fine. That is what actually has been the sixth school of philosophies which emerged in the ancient time. Fine. Now, after that, of course, I told you that Buddhism and Jainism also emerged, but let us discuss Buddhism, Jainism. I will come to the other part. So there only I stopped in fact in my last class. See, Buddhism and Jainism. Now this is another very interesting topic for all of you because the emergence of Buddhism and Jainism can be seen in the backdrop of the you can say the ideas that was prevalent in the society at that particular point of time. See, these six school of philosophies, first of all, didn't emerge together. That's one thing. Second, the sixth school of philosophies, it started emerging by 6th century BCE. Not all, some of them. Fine. Third, that there was I mean, range of time. The range of time in this school of philosophies got emerged. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind that why in 6th century BCE around only the school of philosophy started emerging, and those school of philosophies, they were of course pertaining to not only orthodox ideas, in fact challenging the orthodox ideas, but also coming out with the rational ideas. So in these all school of philosophies, they didn't only challenge the orthodox belief system, but also they provided the rational outlook to the human being. All right. That is what actually has been the significance of these schools of philosophies. But in this background only, we have to also understand that apart from these schools of philosophies, there are some other schools of philosophies also which emerged. And they emerged as a direct challenge to the Brahmanical order that was in existence in the society. Now, this Brahmanical order that I'm talking about in the context of the Vedic period order. Now, in the Vedic period itself, that is, I'm talking about, let's say, Rig Veda or later Vedic period, both. So, by the time of later Vedic period itself, the Brahmanical order started gaining uh, rigidity in the society, started gaining huge presence in the society, and because of that only, there have been a lot of challenges, lot of issues in the society at that particular point of time. Fine. Now, to address that, to address this situation, which was completely dominated by the Brahmanical social order, in which the patriarchy was rooted in our mindset, or rather, it started rooting in our mindset. Secondly, there was a complete, you can say, the Varna order that was based in the society. On the basis of Varna only, the caste was also decided in the society. Thirdly, of course, not only that, but even the position of women were also started degrading the society. Fine. Fourthly, of course, because of the rituals and the practice of sacrifices, millions and millions of animals were butchered in the society in the name of religion, in the name of rituals. So obviously, you can see. I mean, this was the condition under which you see the emergence of some new school of philosophies at that particular point of time, and most importantly, the kind of philosophy that was being promoted by the Vedic school of thought. Now, that was also not understood by the common man at that particular point of time. So that was another limitation of the Vedic school of philosophies at that particular point of time. So the common man, the let's say the non-elite section of society, the deprived section of society, they didn't have any idea that what actually is being taught in the Vedic or under the Vedic philosophy. Fine. So therefore, the idea is this particular system got challenged and challenged by Buddhism and Jainism. Fine. Now, in Buddhism and Jainism, in what form it was challenged, let us just try to understand. See, first and foremost, Buddhism and Jainism that are challenged this entire, you can say, the dogmas of the Buddhism, of the Buddhist, sorry, of the Brahminical practices at a particular point of time. So, all those dogmatic practices inside Brahmanism was challenged by these two religions. In fact, it was not religion at this point of time, it was only a philosophy. So these two philosophies started challenging the dogmatic positions of the Brahmanical school of thought in 6th century BC itself. Fine. Now, from 6th century BC onwards, they didn't only challenge the Brahmanical order, rather, they also provided solution to the human's quest towards spiritualism. Because in 6th century BC, according to many historians, including R.S. Sharma, D.N. Jha, etc., now, according to these historians, by the 6th century BCE, there was a high degree of materialism that entered into the society. So, society had acquired a highly materialistic life at that particular point of time. Now, due to this materialistic life, the people who are having in the category of haves, now they were enjoying their life and they were having all the privileges as well. Now, already society had been divided in such an order that the so-called upper varnas had already been enjoying the social and psychological privilege in the society. Now, even due to the level of improvement in the standard of living in the 6th century, around the 6th century BCE, the economic privileges were also were also grabbed by the upper varnas of society. So, what has happened? The socio-economic privileges were under the command and control of the upper varna of society. Fine. Now, in this background only, Buddhism and Jainism started providing them the solution. Because what will happen to the lower varnas if the upper varnas are having all the privileges, let's say in the society, especially in the context of their social and economic positions? So obviously they were living a highly materialistic life. On the other hand, the lower varna people, especially I'm talking about the Shudras, the Vaishyas, and most importantly, the untouchables. So Sudras, Vaishyas, I mean, and untouchables had also emerged in the society by the 6th century BC, around 6th century BC onwards. So in that way, what will happen to these people? How will they attain so-called moksha? Will they attain moksha? Will they get nirvana? Will they attain the freedom from this particular cycle of life and death? So this particular aspect was addressed in a very simplistic manner by Buddhism and Jainism. Now, that is what actually has been their major contribution. Fine. So, first of all, they challenged the patriarchy in the society, they challenged the Varna order in the society, they challenged the caste system that actually has emerged due to the Varna order in society. So, because of these challenges, they started gaining popularity. And most importantly, when they started also talking in favor of non-violence, compassion, love, harmony, now again they started gaining huge recognition in the society. And the majority of these section society, they were actually deprived sections. They were actually the deprived sections, and some of them, let's say the Vaishyas. Now, Vaishyas did acquire some economic prosperity due to the economic activities, due to the trade and commercial activities, but since they were always looked down upon by the Brahman or in the Brahmanical society by the two upper Varnas, so of course, even they were not being recognized or rather being given or offered the proper position in the society. So Vaishyas were equally frustrated with this Brahmanical system at a point of time. So they were looking for someone who can provide them the solution from every means. From first giving them the social position, recognizing their economic status. Third, providing them the way out for their spiritualism. All right, and fourth, also how to attain moksha. How to attain moksha? That's another very important quest of many of the people at that point of time. So, of course, these answers were given by Buddhism and Jainism. That is the credit of this particular religion, in fact. All right. Now, see, very interestingly, very interestingly, Buddhism provided the solution. Now, Buddhism said, or in fact, Lord Buddha said, which became a part of so called Buddhism. So, Lord Buddha said that why are you unhappy? Why are you feeling deprived or suffered in the life? Why you feel pain in your life? So he said that you feel pain in your life because you actually have an attachment with an object, attachment with a human being, attachment with certain items or elements for which you want that you have to possess that. Now the point is the Buddha said, and then just try to understand then why do you have attachment? Now the attachment is all due to that you are ignorant. All right. So he said first you are having pain. Now why you are having pain? Why you are suffering? Because you have attachment with an object. Now if you don't get that particular object, you feel pain. All right. You feel suffered. You feel frustrated. So Buddha said, then why you are feeling frustrated? Very pertinent idea. I mean, this is applicable in today's life also. So why you are feeling frustrated? Because you have an attachment to that object. Then said, why you have attachment? Buddha said that you are ignorant person. He said, you are ignorant person. Everything is decayable. nothing is going to be permanent. Everything has to pass out. All right. So he said very clearly, everything is decayable. जो आया है वो जाएगा. So don't worry about that. So he said that since you are ignorant, therefore you are attached with an object. And since you are attached with an object, therefore you have a problem in terms of suffering. Then he said, then why you are ignorant? Now you are ignorant because you are not a knowledgeable person. All right. So he said that why are you ignorant? Because you do not have knowledge. You lack knowledge. All right. So you do not have knowledge. You do not know about the reality of the world. You do not know that everything which has come to the world has to go away. So since you do not know, you have these all problems in your life. Then he said, how would you gain knowledge? Then Buddha said, I'll give you the answer to that. You follow my Ashtangik Marg. So how would you get knowledge? According to Buddha, you will gain knowledge only after following Ashtangik Marg. Now, what is Ashtangik Marg? See, Buddha said this Ashtangik Marg is something which is in the context of having a set of code of conduct in one's life. A set of code of conduct in one's life. मतलब क्या है अष्टांगिक मार्ग? उन्होंने बताया कि 8 काम आपको लाइफ में करना चाहिए. क्या क्या है? उन्होंने कहा कि मैं आपको 8 काम बताता हूं लाइफ में जो आपको करना चाहिए. उसमें से मेनली जो काम है वो कुछ ऐसा है कि आपको एक तो पहले एक राइट एम रखना है लाइफ में. All right, so you have to carry right aim in your life. All right, then with right aim you have to also carry a right view regarding that aim in your life. All right, so right aim, and for right aim you have to carry right view regarding that object in your life. And when you carry right aim, right view, then you also have to carry right action in your life. Now, see what he said. He said that when you so when you carry right aim, you have to carry right view in your life. And when you carry right view, you have to carry also right action towards that view in your life. So right action, सही कर्म आपको करना होगा. And with right action, you have to also keep a right speech. Right action के साथ एक right speech भी रखना होगा लाइफ में. ठीक है? Then he said, with the right speech, you have to also carry right effort in your life. So effort also has to be right. And to have a right effort, you need to have a balanced mind. So what is required then? You have to have right mindfulness, right mind in your life. All right. And with the right mind, the mind has to be directed by you, that you have to keep always right concentration in your life. So right concentration is the 7th aim. And then when you keep all these things, then you should always carry right livelihood in your life. Right livelihood, that is jivika. So right livelihood in your life. So if you follow these 8 principles in your life, you will acquire knowledge, you will eliminate ignorance that is there in your life or inside you. And once you are able to remove your ignorance, you will be able to remove your attachment. And once you are able to remove your attachment, you will be able to remove your greed or desire in your life. And once you are able to do that, you are, of course, you are exempted, you are exonerated from any of the world sufferings and pain. And this stage you can only attain after attaining enlightenment. So enlightenment you can attain by following this 8-fold path that is called as Astangik Marg of Buddha. Fine. So Astangik Marg of Buddha was this idea. So therefore, Buddha not only became popular regarding this simple idea that he communicated to everyone, rather, he also spoke about that to attain so-called enlightenment and to remove your ignorance, one does not have to follow a very, let's say, extreme lifestyle. Extreme lifestyle means that you are either following, let's say, extreme austerity, कि एकदम अपने आप को सता के रखना है, कम रोटी खाना है ना, कपड़ा एक ही पहनना है. तो extreme austerity में भी you don't have to live. Now, neither you have to live in extreme opulence. Extreme opulence means luxury. So now you don't have to live in extreme, luxury, enjoying everything of the world, of the life, in the worldly life. All right. So if you keep yourself in between, in between that, you are not even going for the extreme enjoyment in your life, neither you are also pressurizing yourself or following an austere life. If you follow the middle path, that is sufficient for you to acquire enlightenment. Therefore, Buddha is also said to have propounder of Majjhim Marg. Majjhim Marg or middle path. All right.
सर क्या बोल रहे हैं, मध्यम?
हाँ, मध्यम मार्ग और मिडिल पाथ, मध्यम मार्ग. मध्यम कहते हैं पाली में, हिंदी में मध्यम कहते हैं. तो चूंकि पाली में बुद्धा सब कुछ कर रहे थे, इसलिए ये इशू है इसको. All right. So now see, this was actually the issue regarding the first idea of Buddha. This was the first basic idea of Buddha. Second idea that Buddha also communicated, and it is the same idea, in fact, I would tell you, has been borrowed by other schools of philosophies in India after Buddha. Because Buddha once very nicely remarked, Buddha was interacting with one of his disciples named Anand. Anand उनके काफी close थे. And Anand once asked that some Brahmins of that era, now they wanted to enter into Buddhist Sangha, monastery में, संघ में आना चाहते थे. So Anand, with the inquisitiveness, asked Buddha that these Brahmins are so, literate, so knowledgeable, then why they want to come inside our Sangha? So Buddha very rightly remarked, he said that a Brahman is not a Brahman just because he has taken birth in a family of Brahman. So Brahman is not just because that he is born in a family of Brahman. Rather, a Brahman is everyone who does those good and gentle acts in his or her life. So Brahman is, according to Buddha, is just like सोना जैसे तपा हुआ होता है, heated metal, heated gold. So every person who is hated metal, hated gold, and who has understood about the reality of the life, he is a Brahman or she is a Brahman. So with this particular remark, Anand got enlightened about this particular aspect, that who can be a Brahman. So see, I mean, what did he say? He simply said, law of karma decides whether you are Brahman or you are a non-Brahman. It's not because that you have taken birth in the family of Brahman, you will automatically gain the status of Brahman. So he therefore emphasized the philosophy of law of karma for the first time in ancient India. And the same philosophy, of course, perhaps he may have derived from the, let's say, the ideas that may have been there in the surrounding, the ideas of Bhagavad Gita of Mahabharata. I mean, there are two possibilities. One, that the ideas of Bhagavad Gita may have been there in the surrounding, or two, that when Bhagavad Gita was penned down as a part of Mahabharata by Ved Vyas, it was done in the Gupta or post-Gupta period. Mahabharata was not written at one point of time, written in different phases of time. So when he may have written about this, probably he may have also incorporated the idea of law of karma in the book of Mahabharata, where you also find Bhagavad Gita. So the idea is Bhagavad Gita had already spoken about this issue of law of karma. And the same idea was very nicely reiterated by Gautam Buddha. And he said that very clearly, that every individual is the maker of his destiny. Man is a maker of his destiny. So if you want to achieve something in your life, if you want to do something in your life, and you have that particular ability, or that particular, of course, the practice of doing some activity regularly through your law of karma, of course, you are going to achieve that particular aspect in your life. So the idea that he also explained very nicely, that is, law of karma is the fact that decides someone who is Brahman, who is non-Brahman, basically. All right, and that's what actually he also started taking particular idea, that the anyone can attain the status of a Brahman in the society. And that idea became so popular among the non-Brahminical sections, that even they can become Brahman, because earlier people were discriminated in the name of only Brahmins. So they found that, okay, this is an idea, okay, fine, even I can also become a Brahman if I follow certain code of conduct in my life. So therefore he became quite popular. And then he said that Nirvana should be the ultimate goal of one's life. And Nirvana can only be attained when you shed all your desires in your life. You simply do your karma, that is what you do, your work. You don't expect the results. You don't associate or attach with yourself with the results. So work is worship. That also became a philosophy of Vedantic school of philosophy, in fact. Work is worship also became a part of the Vedantic school of philosophy. So Vedantic school of philosophy was equally influenced by the Buddhist school of philosophy regarding this issue. All right. So he talked about that anyone can attain nirvana, and that should be the ultimate goal of a human being, and that can be attained if you are able to shed all your desires. Because if you shed all your desires, it will end your suffering. And once you are ending your suffering, you will attain freedom from this particular cycle of life and death, life and death. Until the time desires will remain in you, you will keep coming on the earth, life and death cycle will keep on continuing. And you will feel the sufferings. So body will have to face the suffering. All right. So that is how Buddha started explaining about his philosophies. And then also he talked about the philosophy of the non-violence, love, harmony in the society, because he very badly attacked the practice of sacrifice, animal sacrifice. The thousands and thousands of animals were sacrificed on a particular occasion like Rajasuya, Aswamedh, So you can imagine that in the words of D.N. Jha, only on Rajasuya, more than 10,000 bulls were butchered. 10,000 plus bulls were butchered. All right, in the name of the rituals. Only bulls. There were other animals also. Horses also butchered. So idea is this is what actually has been the practice across North India. All right. So obviously this practice was challenged by him very nicely in terms of raising the element of compassion in the human being and following the practice of non-violence. So non-violence, spirit of love was also promoted by him. And once one of his disciples asked him whether God exists or not, Lord Buddha again gave a very smart reply that he said that whether God exists or not, even he does not know. So he even does not know whether the God exists or does not exist. But nevertheless, he said that there is no any proof that the God exists. So in nutshell, he was agnostic. He was neither atheist nor a theist. So Buddhism believes in agnosticism. Agnosticism means that you do not believe in theism or atheism. नास्तिक और आस्तिक वाली बात है. तो नहीं आप नास्तिक नहीं आप आस्तिक हैं, आप बीच वाले हैं, पता नहीं है कि नहीं है. ठीक है कि सब कई मन किया तो मंदिर भी चले गए, घंटी बजा दिए, फिर लगा रहे भगवान मन कुछ नहीं है, चलो चलो आज कुछ नहीं है, आज सब कुछ खा सकते हैं, मंगलवार हो या बृहस्पतिवार हो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता है. ठीक है. तो दिस इज हाउ people behave in fact. All right. So of course this is what actually are those people who are actually the part of agnostic class of people in fact. All right. So this is how the Buddha's philosophy became quite popular among the human beings. All right, and gradually, in fact, gradually it acquired a shape of a religion. All right, so in 6th century BC, it was not a religion. In fact, it acquired a shape of religion only by the time of Mauryan Empire came into existence. So it took 300 years for Lord Buddha's ideas to get accepted to the extent of that the people could be following this code of ideas, code of you can say conduct as a part of their religious belief system. Because it was Emperor Asoka who started promoting Buddhism, and then by this time, Buddhism had acquired a shape of a complete religion. All right. So we'll talk about that later on. But the point is, this is how actually his ideas started becoming getting popular. And these ideas of Lord Buddha were also penned down. It's also written down, in fact, all right. And it was written in Sutta Pitak, Sutta Pitak, Sutt, Sutta Pitak, Pitaka. See, in Buddhism, there are various textbooks which gives us information about the origin and evolution and spread of Buddhism. Out of those books, the Triptikas are three baskets. Three baskets are synonymous to three books. And one of the books of Triptikas, Tripitakas, Triptikas. So one of the books of Triptikas is basically Sutta Pitak. Sut, Sutt, Pitak, Pitaka, Pitak. अब ये है क्या? ये आनंद जो उसके डिसाइपल थे, आनंद ने बुद्धा के जितने भी टीचिंग्स थे, जो भी उनके मैसेजेस थे, सभी को इस बुक में कोडिफाई कर दिया था, लिख दिया था. ऑलराइट. तो आनंद recited and he also codified all the messages of Lord Buddha in the Sutta Pitak. So Sutta Pitak is basically the compilation of Buddha's sermons done by Anand. ठीक है. Now, there are two other books. You can also write that because anyhow I have to discuss that later on. One was Sut Pitak, second one was Vinay Pitak. Vinay, Vinaya, Vinaya, Vinay Pitak. Now, Vinay Pitak was compiled by Upali, 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 and Vinay Pitak was the compilation of the code of conduct for the monks and nuns inside inside the monasteries. All right. So inside monasteries, it was they had to follow certain code of conduct. Who? The monks and the nuns. Fine. So these were written in the Vinay Pitak. Fine. And the third book was Abhidhamb Pitak. Abhidham. ABHIDHAMMA. Abhidhamb Pitak. All right. Now, what was this Abhidhamb Pitak? Now, see, Abhidhamb Pitak was the compilation of the philosophy, very important fact, the philosophy and the psychology of Buddhism, philosophy and psychology of Buddhism, it was done later on. Abhidhamb Pitak was compiled later on in the third Buddhist council by Mogliput Tissa. By Mogliput, Mogli, Mogliputta, Mogliput Tissa, Tissa, Tissa. So he compiled Abhidhamb Pitak, that is the philosophy of Buddhism, in fact. All right. So these are the three very important textbooks which support the idea of Buddhism, or rather which informs us regarding the idea of Buddhism. Fine. That is a point which you have to always remember, in fact. Fine. Now, coming to the next school of philosophy, that is of Jainism. See, Jainism was equally a part of the heterodox sects. Why? Because it challenged the orthodoxy of Brahmanism as well. Fine. Now, in Jainism, now let me tell you what was there in Jainism very specifically, because I will have to draw a certain figure to make you understand it clearly. Now, see, Jainism as a philosophy had already been there. All right. It was Mahavir who was not only able to promote Jainism, promote and propagate both. So he was not only able to promote and propagate Jainism, rather, he provided a new lease of life to Jainism. So indirectly, I would like to say that the idea of Jainism, which became popular only after the contribution of Mahavir or Lord Mahavir, those ideas were already prevailing even before his arrival in the scene of Jainism. For example, you can understand like this way: the first Tirthankar, the Tirthankars are the preachers of Jainism. Those who got enlightened. All right. So the first Tirthankar happened to be Rishabhnath in Jainism. And by the time the 23rd Tirthankar, Mahavir was 24th Tirthankar. Mahavir was 24th Tirthankar. By the time I was telling to all of you, the 23rd Tirthankar named Parshavnath. Now, Parshavnath, he had already advocated certain basic philosophy of Jainism, like one has to always speak truth. Second, one has to follow the policy of non-violence in one's life. Third, one has to also follow a policy of non-possession, that you should not worry about possessing everything in your life. All right, जो आया जो मिला वो भी अच्छा, जो नहीं मिला वो भी अच्छा. So that sort of philosophy you have to keep in your life. All right, that is non-possession. And something then, fourth was not to receive anything which has not been given to you voluntarily, which has not been given to you voluntarily. So in other words, the idea is simple, that you remember the dialogue of Amitabh Bachchan in Diwar. मैं फेंके हुए रुपए आज भी नहीं उठाता हूं. Right. So the idea is simple, straightforward, कि अमिताभ बच्चन बचपन में भी फेंका हुआ रुपया नहीं उठाता था, और जब बाद में बहुत बड़ा गैम्बलर और कह सकते हैं कि आदमी बन गया, ऑलराइट, जब when he became a big sort of person, then also he said the same dialogue that आज भी मैं फेंके हुए पैसे नहीं उठाता हूं. So something that has not been given to you voluntarily, Amitabh Bachchan never received it. So exactly a simple idea is he was following somewhere down the line the philosophy of Jainism only. All right, but whether he was knowing it or not knowing it, that's another thing. But he was following this philosophy only. So these four philosophies were already there with the Jainism. Now, Lord Mahavira added one more philosophy. There's a fifth one, and that is celibacy. Now, that's another very great thing that he contributed. If you remain unmarried, you will have no problem in your life. All right. So you can learn it from our dear Prime Minister also. Even if he get married or rather he got married, he finally became unmarried in that way. So idea is celibacy is another philosophy that he added. All right. Now, what celibacy? Celibacy was something in the context of you have to remain unmarried. All right. So you have to live a celibate life throughout your journey. So Mahavira added celibacy, and this is how he provided the 5 pillars of the philosophy of Jainism, in fact. So these are the 5 pillars of philosophy of Jainism that he actually, in fact, not only, elaborated, or rather he also propagated these philosophies among his disciples. That was Mahavira's first contribution. Second, second was another very interesting philosophy that he talked about. Now he again spoke about the same idea which Buddha had spoken about. Now Buddha had spoken about that how can you attain nirvana. Now what was nirvana in Buddhism was moksha in Jainism. So what he did promoted, or he also started promoting what Buddha promoted in the form of nirvana. Nirvana is something that you are free from the cycle of life and death. That is nirvana. You are free from the cycle of life and death is basically nirvana. And according to Jaina or Mahavir, moksha one can attain to get himself or herself free from this cycle of life and death. And how it can be done? Now, is what he said. See, simple philosophy was given by him. He said that, I mean, there is always a soul in every human body. So he believed in soul. I mean, of course, Buddha was not clear. That's a very remarkable difference. Buddha was not clear whether soul exists or does not exist. Buddha was not clear whether transmigration of soul does or it happens or not does not happen. All right. So he never spoke about soul in that way. But Mahavira did talk about soul. So what did he say? He said that inside every human being, there's a soul. Now, this soul is surrounded by various kinds of barbed wires, bondages. These are the bondage in one's life. Bondage simply means your attachment to the same thing, the what Buddha said. Attachment to the object, attachment to the living being, attachment to any particular item in your surrounding. So your soul is surrounded by the various kinds of bondages. All right. And these bondages are created by the desires of your previous birth. All right. So since in your previous birth your desires did not get fulfilled, therefore you have again taken a birth. All right. So as long as you keep your desire alive, you will keep taking birth on the earth. That's actually the philosophy of Jaina. So the idea is that since these desires were created in your past or previous birth, so because of that, the soul that has acquired a new body, though that still is under the bondages or under the series of bondages, in fact. So a human being will have to make an effort. I mean, how would you attain so-called, let's say, moksha? Because he was giving the idea of how can you attain moksha. He said that you can attain moksha once you are able to remove these bondages. So there should be some continuous effort to remove these bondages. Fine, to free yourself from these all bondages. Once you keep continuous making effort, and this effort has to be attached with the the life of a severe asceticism. So if you live a life of a severe asceticism, that is the extreme penance, all right, extreme penance, then you will be able to attain enlightenment. And once you're able to attain enlightenment, simply means a stage of knowledge. You're able to attain the knowledge in your life. Knowledge about this kuch nahi, sab kuch maya hai, basically. All right. So of course you will attain this knowledge, and once you attain this knowledge, you will attain moksha. But how would you attain this knowledge? You can't attain knowledge so easily. Of course, you have to go for this severe asceticism. That's one thing. And along with this, you have to keep three philosophies of life always intact. Three principles in your life always intact, in fact, according to Lord Mahavir. One is right knowledge. Another one is right belief. And third one is your right action. The right knowledge, right belief, and right action. So if you follow in your life these three principles, that is right belief, right knowledge, right action, then you can be able to achieve moksha. So the moksha you will be able to achieve only by having these practices in your life, and that moksha is something which will liberate your soul from bondages. So your soul will become a free soul. In fact, है ना, लोग कुछ कहते भी है कि I am a free soul. All right. So of course, this free soul is something that is away from any kind of societal, personal, emotional, psychological bondages. All right. So this is what actually was his philosophy that he propounded, or rather he. So I hope you are there now.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think there was some internet disruption in between. All right. All right. So yes. So I was talking about this particular aspect only. So then he spoke about these all I mean the issues regarding how one can attain so-called moksha from the life. All right. So this moksha can be attained by practicing or having these three right belief, right knowledge, right action in one's life. Fine. Then it can be done through the severe ascetic practices, the extreme penance one has to follow in one's life. Fine. And then he also talked about that that one has to also avoid evil karmas or bad activities or bad actions. So one has to avoid evil karmas, and that evil karmas simply means that one has to go for non-injury, non-stealing, non-adultery, speaking truth, non-possession. So if you follow these five principles in your life, you will avoid doing any evil karmas. Fine. And once you do this exercise, then it is required for you to join a monastic life, a life in the monastery. All right. So in the monastic life, you will be attaining salvation. All right. Because a householder cannot attain salvation because he will be attached with lot of bondages, family obligation, parental obligation. All right. Various other obligations, in fact. So what did he say? He said that first of all, you have to follow these five principles. And then second, you have to leave the home and you have to go for a monastic life. Fine. And there in monastic life, you have to live a life of, I mean, high degree of ascetic. साधु के रूप में रखना है आपको. Fine. And there only you will be attaining your so-called salvation. So therefore, there's a practice of salekhan in Jainism. Salekhan, you may be knowing about it. Salekhana or Salekhan. Now, what is Salekhan? Salekhan is following extreme penance. You have to remain without food and water to simply give away your life. That's basically suicide. अगर हम लीगल भाषा में बोले, so it's basically suicide. So of course it was a sort of a suicide practice which was supported by Mahavir, Lord Mahavir in Jainism. Because Salekhan is suicide. However, I don't know whether I mean, of course, there was an issue. I remember a few years back, one Jaina, of course, nun, she wanted to go for Salekhan. However, the government had to stop her because suicide is still a crime in India. So Salekhan, according to the religion, it was of course allowed practice, and there is always a religious freedom that has also been guaranteed as per the Indian Constitution in the fundamental rights. So that was an issue with the government how to go about that. All right. So this is a particular practice which keeps on coming in the news always because of the Salekhan practice. Now see, Chandragupta Maurya also did Salekhan. In fact, Chandragupta Maurya, he adopted Jainism and he went for Salekhana only. So he passed away due to Salekhan. All right. So this is how you can see. I mean, people have been there in the past also, who actually not only very openly adopted Jainism, but rather also followed the practice and the principles of Jainism very religiously. In fact, fine, fine. So this is how the idea of you can say teachings of Mahavira started becoming popular, and his teachings were also codified in Purvas. Purvas are the textbooks of Jainism where the teachings of Mahavira have been codified. Just like Pitaks of Buddhism, Purvas are in Jainism. So teachings of Mahavira were codified in this Purvas. All right. So Purvas are further divided into Angas, Upangas. I mean, these are textbooks, in fact, of Jainism. Fine. So this is how Jainism had to be understood. So that was the philosophy of Jainism. So exactly the point is not about understanding the philosophy. The point is that how these philosophies contributed in the change of the, you can say, the lifestyle of the human being. Art and culture, how it got influenced. I can tell you about how it got influenced. See, these two religions supported the idea of ascetic life, the idea of course, living the life, or in fact, living the worldly affairs of the life, in fact. And to attain moksha, you will have to go for the quest towards knowledge, attaining more and more knowledge. So to attain knowledge, it is not possible to attain those knowledge, I mean, within the human setup, or the societal setup, in fact. So you have to go for the ascetic life food or lifestyle, in fact. Now because of that only, both Buddhism and Jainism supported this idea. You see the emergence of the concepts like Chaitya and monasteries, viharas, emerged at a larger scale in India. Fine. I mean, see the philosophy, how it contributed in the development of art and architecture of India. So, because of these philosophies only, Chaityas and viharas got promoted. Not only got promoted, rather, entire ancient India's art and architecture is primarily based upon the construction of the stupas, Chaityas, and viharas. Now, the stupas I'll discuss in the class of architecture, but here let me tell you briefly. Stupas happen to be the relics of Buddha and his disciples, which were kept inside the stupa and which was meant for the worshipping for the monks. Relics means after cremation of your body, the ashes were kept. All right. And those ashes, a stupa was constructed for the worshipping or for the meditation of the disciples or the followers. Chaityas were the meeting hall, praying hall. So where the monks can pray together, of course, inside the Chaityas. So Chaityas were constructed due to this. Then where the monks can stay together, in the monasteries. So monasteries were constructed for this. So see, I mean, this is why, I mean, both Buddhism and Jainism were responsible in the promotion of this type of architecture in India. Even in Jainism, the idea of Chaityas and viharas were quite dominant, not stupas, but Chaityas and viharas were dominant. Fine. So that you see, I mean, Chaityas and viharas have been constructed across the country, right from Tamil Nadu to the states like Himachal. You have huge number of Chaityas. Even Ladakh, you have a huge number of viharas, Chaityas, and stupas. So तमिलनाडु नाडु से लेके कश्मीर तक आपके पास ये सारा कंस्ट्रक्शन है, और भारत के आप साउथ ईस्ट एशिया के छोर से लेके यू गो टू तुर्किस्तान और उज्बेकिस्तान, वहां तक कंस्ट्रक्शन है. सो That is what was the spread of these two religions, especially I'm talking about Buddhism, in fact. So see, and this is how these philosophies played a very important role in deciding the fate of India as far as art and architectures were concerned. Fine. Now coming to the next dimension, and that is the era of Bhakti and Sufi. Because these two philosophies remained the most dominant philosophies, then Bhakti and Sufi emerged. Now, Bhaktism and Sufi philosophy. See, primarily speaking to all of you, that the major contribution of Bhakti school of thought in India was the revival of Hinduism. Otherwise, Hinduism, according to me, would have been completely wiped out from India. All right, I have gone through a lot of textbooks and I have realized this particular fact that this movement has been another lease of life for Hinduism in India. All right, so Hinduism would have been wiped out either by, of course, you can say Buddhism or by Islamic forces outrightly in India, had this particular movement not taken place in India at this particular moment. Because anyhow, if you see, I mean, developments of India, I mean, if you very minutely observe the entire developments of India, especially after the modern time, or rather from the modern time onwards, Buddhism started penetrating into the mindsets like this way that every next day, I would say, thousands and thousands of followers were becoming a part of Buddhism. Every next day. Because it was such a simplistic religion. There was no ritual as such, no paisa kharch, but religion का सारा purpose serve हो रहा था. The idea is simple. I mean, our religion, it also forces us to spend a lot of money. ठीक है, चाहे वो मंदिर में जाके चंदा दे दो, चाहे राम मंदिर बन जाए उसके लिए चंदा दे दो, चाहे आप दूध चढ़ा दो, चाहे आप फल चढ़ा दो, लेकिन पैसा खर्च बहुत होता है भाई. ठीक है, पंडित जी को बुलाओ तो 1000 रुपए से कम लेंगे नहीं. So idea is that obviously, I mean, in our religion we have to spend a lot of money. Obviously, this factor was not there in the case of Buddhism. And Buddhism was gaining such a huge recognition from the trading and merchant class that they, wherever they were, in fact, trading merchant class happened to be there in India right from the beginning. So wherever they used to go, right from, let's say, the Central Asia to almost to the extent of, you can say, the Mediterranean Ocean region, they used to spread Buddhism. They used to construct stupas and Buddhist, you can say, the Buddhist symbols over there. That's why you can know, you can understand that biggest of the statues of Buddha was constructed in Bamiyan in Afghanistan. Fine. So that's what actually was the status of Buddhism at that particular point of time. So thanks to Bhakti movement, that it actually played a role in terms of reviving of the so-called Brahmanism with a new form that is called as Hinduism. So Brahmanism was reformed and Hinduism had emerged out of Brahmanism. Now, why Hinduism? Because obviously by this time the Arabs started entering into India, and the religion that we were practicing, the Indians were practicing at that particular point of time, they started calling it as Hinduism. The same Brahmanism was being called as Hinduism. But this Hinduism was reformed Hinduism, in fact. It was not in a firm believer of orthodoxy. It was not in the firm believer of, let's say, the high, let's say, level of a degree of rituals, compulsory rituals. It made open for all the class and caste to enter into Hinduism. I mean, everyone was allowed to enter into Hinduism, whether the Vaishyas, Sudras, untouchables. So something that had to be done earlier, it was done at in this particular phase. So once it was done, then of course there's a new lease of life came into this particular order. So Bhakti school of thought, it actually did not only challenge the dominance of Buddhism in India. I mean, देखो कितना तगड़ा इंडिया में खेल हो रहा है रिलीजन का. I mean, earlier Brahmanism was challenged by Buddhism. Now Buddhism is going to be challenged by Hinduism. All right. So now you see Hinduism challenged the evil practices also that crept in Buddhism. बुद्धिज्म में बहुत सारे evil practices enter कर चुके थे. All right. Now, one of, again, my observation, I would not quote any historian's name here. One of my observation is simple, that it is all due to the Brahmins entered into Buddhism. They adopted Buddhism, and not only they adopted Buddhism, rather they even started manipulating Buddhism. That is a fact. And I can quote on various examples. Why? Because if you see the leaders of this Buddhist, you can say, philosophy, after, I mean, in fact, from Gupta period onwards, or even before that, in fact, also there are certain instances. All the chief of the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries, who were there? They were originally Brahmins, changed into Buddhism, and then they became the chief of those monasteries. I mean, I don't know whether it was a ploy or it was a it was a set goal to actually, let's say, defame Buddhism. I don't know about it, but the fact of the matter is this: that is actually the reality, in fact. So if you see I mean, I just told you Mogliput Tissa. Now, Mogliput Tissa was not at all a Brahmin. He was not at all a Brahmin. He belonged to the Vaishya class. He adopted a Buddhist name, Mogliput Tissa. Tissa was a Buddhist name at that point of time. So he was not a Brahmin. But you see the fourth Buddhist council, it was conducted during the time of Kanishk in Kashmir. And who was the chief of fourth Buddhist council?
Vashumitra.
Vasumitra. Now, Vasumitra, he was a Brahmin, he was not a Buddhist. Upali was a Buddhist. Anand was a Buddhist. Vasumitra was not a Buddhist originally. He was a Brahmin who converted into Buddhism. And what I was saying to all of you, and why I'm telling you to all of you, that Buddhism adopted tantric practices. Tantricism entered into Buddhism. Isn't it? It's a remarkable thing. Tantricism entered into Buddhism, and Buddhism became Vajrayana. Another sect of Buddhism emerged in India, which was not heard of before this. So tantric practices entered into Buddhism, and that exactly has been the factor of demise of Buddhism ultimately from India. तो अब क्या हुआ कि तांत्रिसिज्म जो ब्राह्मणिज्म में एविल फैक्टर था वो घुस गया बुद्धिज्म में, और इधर ब्राह्मणिकल जो रिलीजन था वो रिफॉर्म कर लिया अपने आप को. ठीक है, रिफॉर्म किया और साथ साथ उसको सपोर्ट मिल गया, एंड सपोर्ट मिला, दिस अगेन दे स्टार्टेड स्प्रेडिंग. And this Bhakti movement played a very instrumental role in doing that. Because what Bhakti movement did, Bhakti movement played a role in revival of spiritualism or spiritual order inside Hinduism in India. So Bhakti said, or Bhakti saint said, Hinduism is not a religion, it's a way of life. And that is true, in fact. That is true. Hinduism still is not a religion, in fact. It's a way of life, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we interact with the nature, with the way we interact with our elders in our society. That's equally all ingredients are part of Hinduism today. So idea is Sankaracharya, Vallabhacharya, Madhavacharya, and most remarkable role played by Ramanuj. Now see, Sankaracharya was able to revive the spiritual quest among the Hindus. There's no doubt about it, that he talked about that devotion to that Almighty, which is not visible. Again, see, I mean, this is how he changed this entire contours. Earlier, what used to happen, there has to be an Almighty which must be visible. Idol worship. So idol worship, he changed. He said, no, There's no need of idol worship. God is everywhere. God is everywhere, and we have to only internalize that particular God within us. Fine. So what you see here, you see that he talked about something which is still being talked by every other religion, in fact. So the idea that he started communicating by Shankaracharya, he communicated that there is no separate existence of a soul. We all are a part of the same larger being who is invisible God, and that is the reason why his philosophy is called as monism, Advaitwad. There's no separate existence of soul and the world. सोल वर्ल्ड सब एक ही आदमी का है, वो ऊपर वाले का है. ऊपर वाला कौन है? वो फॉर्मलेस है, वो हर जगह है. So when he started talking about such kind of ideas, he happened to promote the idea of so-called Nirgun school of thought. Fine. And here the another very remarkable feat was achieved by Ramanuj. So see, Ramanujan, what did he do? He actually started propagating the idea that the what was taught in Vedas have not been irrelevant. Now see, I mean, this is how he linked Vedas with Bhakti movement very nicely. Therefore, Ramanujan had been called by many of the scholars as a real revival of Hinduism in India. शंकराचार्य का तो सिर्फ इतना कहना था कि भाई स्पिरिचुअलिज्म की तरफ अब जाओ, धर्म वही है. रामानुज ने कहा कि स्पिरिचुअलिज्म की तरफ क्यों जाओ, धर्म वो है जो वेदा में बताया था. धर्म वो है जो वेदा में बताया था, अब आपको उसको रैशनली इंटरप्रेट करना है, बस यही धर्म है ना. सो व्हाट ही सेड, he tried to link Veda with Bhakti movement. So Ramanuj acted as a bridge between the Veda with the Bhakti movement for the first time. All right, so he acted as a bridge, and that is precisely the reason why he was very popular. He was very popular in South India, and he became equally very popular across India. So Ramanuj played a very cardinal role in terms of the revival of Bhaktism, revival of Hinduism, in fact, in India. And how did he do that? He simply tried to establish some fundamental factors, and that was that he said that the learning of Vedas are still relevant. People must learn Vedas, people must know about Vedas, and the most remarkable thing about Vedas are that Vedas do talk about the spiritual quest of a human being can be served by devoting himself or herself towards the natural beings. So natural beings should be respected, honored, and that is what actually Ramanujan also started talking about. But his ideas became popular in the context of promoting the idea of Vaishnavism in India. Because Ramanuj was not a Nirgun saint. He was a philosopher of Sagun saint. He didn't talk about formless God. He said Vishnu is the ultimate God. So Vishnu is the ultimate God, and this description of Vishnu has also been given in the Vedic textbooks. So Vaishnavism became quite popular in South India because of the contributions of Ramanuj. All right. Therefore, even Vaishnavism came into conflict with Saivism in South India, but he was able to protect Vaishnavism to a larger extent, and he became quite popular in South India, and especially those regions where the Lord Vishnu is still worshipped. All right. So this is how Ramanuj contributed in terms of promoting the Bhakti school of thought. And then afterwards, you see, afterwards, I mean, Sagun, Nirgun schools of philosophies got emerged across India. Fine. Sagun philosophy, Nirgun philosophy started emerging. So Sagun was the people who believed in God. in the godly features, the attributes of a god. They were called as Sagun school of thinkers. All right. So Sagun and Nirgun. Sagun and Nirgun. So Bhaktism by 11th century itself, it emerged into Sagun and Nirgun school of thought. Now Sagun was believer in the godly attributes, and Nirgun was the believer in the formless God. Fine. Some of the remarkable, you can say, leaders of Bhakti movement or the saints of Bhakti movement, especially I would say in the Nirgun sect, were people like Kabir. Kabir, he became the follower of the Nirgun sect. All right. Kabir was the biggest propagator of the Nirgun sect. Then even you can see emergence of Sikh religion by Guru Nanak. So Guru Nanak became the another biggest propounder of the Nirgun school of thought. Fine. So Kabir had become quite popular because of his, of course, dohas. Fine. So that is what Kabir and Guru Nanak is known for. Similarly, in Sagun also we got various streams of Sagun like Vaishnavite cult, Saivite cult. So Shiv and Vishnu followers increased in India tremendously. So some of the other were either the Saivites or the Vaishnavites. For example, in South India, the Saivites were called as Nayanars. 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 So Nayanars. So there were 63 Nayanar saints in South India. And the Vaishnavites in South India were called as Alvars. Alvars. So Alvars were the follower of Vishnu or Vaishnavism, in fact. All right. So there were 12 Alvar saints in South India. Fine. So you can see these all saints, either they were following the Siv or Saivite religion or Vaishnavite religion, but there were certain common things among them. All of them protested against caste system. They challenged caste system. Therefore, they became popular. I mean, had they not been doing this exercise, they would not have remained in India for sure. They would have been in minority. Now they started, I mean, of course, condemning caste system and dominance of Brahmins as well. And they tried to reform their system altogether. And right from Brahmins to untouchables, everyone was invited to adopt either of these two religions. So this is how they reformed it themselves. And the Alvar saints, Nayanar saints, they started propagating the messages of God across every nook and corner of India, especially in South India, dominated by in South India. And even in North India also, we see the emergence of even the Ramite and Krishnite cult. In North India, from Vaishnavites only, you see the emergence of even Ramite and Krishnite cult. The Ramite and Krishnite cult. The Ramite cult was the followers of Lord Rama, especially like Tulsidas. All right, so Tulsidas penned down Ramcharitmanas. So Tulsidas became the biggest propagator of the Ramite cult. followed by even Nabhadas and others. Similarly, in Krishnite cult, we got the names like Nimbarka, Vallabhacharya, the most remarkable one, Chaitanya, so who is said to have propagated the Krishnite cult in entire eastern India, regions like Assam, Bengal, Odisha. They all got promoted, or they all actually got under the influence of Krishnite cult due to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. All right, so Chaitanya, Surdas, Mirabai. Now, they are the few names. I mean, there are, I mean, a lot of names, in fact. There are at least more than dozens of names were still there. And they all were the followers of either of these, all you can say, the cult that came out from the Vaishnavite cult only. Fine. I mean, you need to understand that. For example, I give you one example to understand it clearly. That the followers of Vaishnavites, when they face a challenge from Ramite and Krishnite cult, they also propose a concept of avatar system in Hinduism. Avatar. And they propagated the message that Ram and Krishna are the avatars of Vishnu. Ram and Krishna's are, or Krishna, God, Krishna, Ram, both are the avatars of Vishnu. So they're part of the same stream. They're part of the same stream. They're only tributaries. All right. So idea is Ramite and Krishnite cults are tributaries of Vaishnavites. And it has also been proven by the fact that in Ramcharitmanas, of course, Tulsidas has also mentioned it, that Ram was an avatar of Vishnu only. So this is how the avatar system also entered into the Indian religion slowly and gradually. Fine. And by the time when we enter into the era of, let's say, in the medieval era, I was talking about, especially the Vijayanagar Empire. In Vijayanagar Empire, we find the worshipping of even a particular god named Harihar. Harihar. Now, Hari is Vishnu and Har is Shiva. So the combination of Vishnu and Shiva were also getting worshipped together. Why? Because both of them were competing against each other, especially in terms of their followers. All right. Some kingdoms were followers of Lord Shiva. Some kingdom and kings were followers of Lord Vishnu. And because of that only, there have been regular fights. For example, I can give you some examples to simply corroborate my fact. Ramanujan. Now, Saint Ramanujan, he was a follower of Vishnu or Vaishnavite, but he was living in the Chola Empire. And Cholas were the followers of Saivite. All right. So Ramanuj was thrown away from the state just because of this fact that he was worshipper of Vishnu. So now you see in Vijayanagar what was done? A middle path, Harihar. So that believers of any cult or any faith, they should bestow their faith to the entire empire, because here both of the gods are worshipped together. Fine. And by this time, the concept of triumvirate, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, had got established in Indian religion. So worshipping of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh got established by this time firmly in Indian religion. So that was the story of the Bhakti school of thought in terms of providing a new philosophy, new lease of life to Hinduism at that point of time. Now, similarly, Sufism. Now, Sufism played another very cardinal role in terms of providing a very strong philosophy for the foreigners who entered India as an invaders. All right. and it was Sufism which actually talked about Wahadat ul Wujud. Wahadat ul Wujud was the philosophy of Sufism. That is unity of being, which means that the God and the soul are together always. In every soul, you will find the existence of God. So God and soul are not different. So there's no different religion. There's no different God. God is one. All right. So God is only one. There's no different religion. Now, this is something which needed at this particular point of time. You understand, this time Hinduism was emerging at its another force. On the other hand, Islam was penetrating into India. Now, had this philosophy been not there, then there would have been clash of civilizations at a higher scale, could have been a genocide in India like anything. So obviously that provided a middle path. That is what is called in English rapprochement. All right.
Sir, can you please repeat the last point? वो Islam वाला I missed it.
Yeah, I'm repeating it. So idea is this philosophy which said that God and soul are one. In other words, for in every soul there is an existence of God. Therefore, a person, either Hindu, non-Hindu, Islam, non-Islamic, they all are having the same soul of the God. So they all are the descendants or the children of God. And there's one God for everyone. So this provided a very important, we can say, a supporting system, a middle path that is called a rapprochement between Islam and Hinduism at that particular point of time. Because you need to understand what this Sufi saints did. See, first of all, who were the Sufi saints? Just try to understand briefly that aspect. See, Sufi saints were the mystic preachers. They were preachers of mysticism. Mysticism means that they used to talk about that God is one and everyone belongs to that God only. They used to talk about that one has to devote in worshipping of God unconditionally, just like bhakti. Because what is in the bhakti movement? Bhakti movement preached one common thing, that is devotion to God. With the Mirabai, devotion was there, or the devotion of even, let's say, Kabir was there. All of them were devoted to a God, whether they were Nirgun or Sagun. But even Kabir was equally devoted to his God. All right. So exactly, Chaitanya was devoted equally to his God. So the idea is that even in Sufism, the Sufi saints started promoting and propagating the philosophy of devotion to the God who is formless, who is not seen, who is present everywhere, and the God and the public or the people, they should enjoy a relationship between the peer or the murid. Peer means PIR, peer. Peer means teacher. Teacher. So God is a teacher. And murid. Murid are the disciples. All right. So there should be a relationship between the God and the people, like Pir and Murid. All right. And they all promoted the idea of that one has to simply devote in the worship and the service of that Almighty. Fine. And this Almighty is present in everyone. So indirectly, it is a service to everyone. Indirectly, it is service for the mankind. Love and harmony for the mankind. So if you show your love and harmony to the mankind, that is actually a gesture towards your God. So something, of course, was needed at this particular point of time. Because had this been not there, then perhaps the two religions would have come under a clash, a direct clash, and that could have been quite deciding factor for entire country, India. So this is how you see the Sufism emerged in India and as started getting popularity in India. But the most remarkable thing about Sufism is not about all these things. In fact, let me tell you what was the most remarkable thing about Sufism in India. That Sufism provided that platform on which both Hinduism and Islam can meet together. How? Let me tell you how. See, now you see, this is a perfect diagram to make you understand about the issues regarding Sufism and how it provided that particular platform on which both these religions met together, and they not only met together but they remained peacefully also in India. If you can see on your screen, I have made a particular triangle which shows you that on three extreme points of this triangle there are three important elements. One is, of course, Islam, which entered in India, all right, with the entry of course, the various foreign invaders, right from Muhammad bin Qasim onwards, all right, and then of course Qutbuddin Aibak establishing the Sultanate rule over here in India. So Islam entering India and finally finding India as the permanent land for their existence, because still here Islam was entering into India, but they were entering for either two purposes, either trade and commerce or looting India and going back. All right, plundering India and going back. That used to be done. I mean, that was common thing that was being done right from the 9th century itself. ठीक है, लेकिन पहली बार ये आए यहाँ रहने. Now they decided to make India, or this particular part of India, which according to them was Hindustan, to live permanently here. Now they were in minority. You need to understand, they may have been in thousands. Of course, they were united on certain parameters. They were a skilled force. So because of that particular factor, even if they were minority, they could easily rule over majority. All right. So the idea is they entered in thousands, fine, but they had to rule over lakhs. And these lakhs were not united politically. That was in their advantage. They were united only on their socio-cultural practices. Politically, they were divided completely. And that advantage they took in India. But one thing that used to unite them, that was their socio-cultural practices, because majority of them were Hindus. Now they had to rule over the alien culture, according to them, because they have not interacted this particularly Hinduism in Central Asia or in Persia or in, let's say, Iraq or any part of the world except in India. So for the first time, they came into contact with the particular Hindus, and most importantly, they had to rule over India according to the Shariat law. Shariat law, basically Islamic law. So Islamic law. Now Islamic law says that if you have to rule over non-Islamic people, then you have to collect from them, let's say, some tax, like jizya. Now what is jizya? Jizya was a religious tax imposed upon Hindus or non-Islamic forces, honestly, like this way. So jizya was a religious tax which was approved under the Shariat law. शरीयत लॉ क्या कहता था? या तो आप नॉन इस्लामिक को कन्वर्ट कर दो यार इस्लाम में, ठीक। अगर ये नहीं पॉसिबल है तो उनसे तो ये लेना ही पड़ेगा आपको, नहीं तो यू कांट रूल, नहीं तो दैट विल बी कॉल्ड एज डेफियंस ऑफ शरा और शरीयत. So you can't be defiant against Shariat. Otherwise, your rule will not be approved by Khalifa, who is sitting somewhere in Persia or Saudi Arabia. So see, I mean, this is what actually was the practice. And now, this, whether this ruler who are following Islam or who are Islamic rulers, in fact, whether they are following Sharia or not, who will take care? Now for them, they have been appointed. Ulemas. Now who were the ulemas? Ulemas were the Maulvis, the religious interpreters. Religious interpreters. Now, ulemas were given the charge of monitoring the rulers whether ruling according to Sharia or not. If not, then ulemas had to challenge the authority of ruler. Ulemas will say, you are not authorized to rule now in India or on Hindustan. You have to quit and give your rule to someone else who can impose Sharia as per the provisions, as per the law. Now see, this was a difficulty for any Islamic ruler to rule over India, because it was not possible for them, first and foremost, to convert everyone into Islam. India was not a country like Persia, not a country like Greece. All right, India was such a big country that they cannot even enter into every part and every nook and corner of India. They only control North India, and entire East India and South India were out of their control. So the idea is that definitely they had to understand that they cannot convert everyone into Islam, and they understood it. Now the only option with them was to charge jizya. Fine. Now this is the perfect Islamic practice which was supposed to be done in India. Now in both the cases, Hindus were not going to accept Islam. There would be reaction from the Hindus for sure. Reaction against Islam, reaction against Shariat law, reaction against also the ulema's interpretations. Now here the role was played by Sufi saints. So Sufi saints were either promoted by the rulers at times, or also the Sufi saints themselves came to counter ulema's control over Sultanate. So Sufi saints, they adopted a life of a mendicant. Mendicant means, of course, beggar, basically. They used to adopt a life of a beggar. They used to live in khanka. Khanka means a small place where they can only sleep in the night. And throughout the day, they used to, of course, move around the country, move around the areas as an ascetic, and used to communicate among the people regarding the understanding about Islam, regarding the understanding about their religion and their spirit of their religion, in fact. So Sufi saints were playing that particular role right from the beginning. Fine. And there were various schools of Sufi saints, orders of Sufi saints. Some of the remarkable orders of Sufi saints who became quite popular, like there were Chisti order, Chisti school of Sufi saints. There were also Shuhrawardi order, Suhrawardi school of Sufi saints. There was also Kalandari order, Naqshbandi order. There were various schools. I mean, in fact, 12 silsilas were there. Naqshbandi order. So there were various schools of Sufi saint that was in existence in India. But out of them, Chisti became the most popular among not only the Hindus but also among the Muslims. Because here the role played by Muinuddin Chisti, who has his mausoleum in Ajmer today, of one of the very famous place जहां पे उर्स मेला लगता है अभी भी. So Muhyiddin Chisti of Ajmer became highly popular, hugely popular in India because of his ideas of Sufism, because he was understood as a direct Masiha of course, Prophet Muhammad in that way. And he used to talk in a very neutral manner without even referring about any particular god. So this is how he provided a solace to everyone whosoever used to go to meet Muhyiddin Chisti. So Muhyiddin Chisti became one of the biggest of these Sufi saints in India. And not only that, his own disciple, Nizamuddin Aulia. Now Nizamuddin Aulia in Delhi, he has his mausoleum in Delhi. So Nizamuddin Aulia also became another very famous Sufi saint of India. All right, and all of them, I mean, both of them, in fact, they were the biggest propagator of the religious harmony, peace, composite culture, and they were equally promoting the issues or the, you can say, the interest of both Hindus and Muslims, in fact. So this is how you see the Sufi saints provided a middle path for Islam and Hinduism to come together. Fine. And you can simply understand the development of few great examples before all of us. Had Sufism been not there, we would not have learnt about the importance of Urdu. So Urdu as a language has come into our domain because of the entry of Sufi saints only, because they promoted the composite culture. Similarly, the practice of Qawwali. The Qawwali, if you have ever heard, ever watched, it is again a contribution of the Sufi saints only. And they were also able to contribute in the development of various languages and scripts across India. For example, you can understand one of the Sufi saints named Baba Farid. Now, Baba Farid used to talk in the local Punjabi languages. And his ideas was also incorporated into the Guru Granth Sahib of Sikh religion. Now, that is how he played, in fact, all Sufi saints played a role in the emergence of the composite culture in India. Fine. That was the biggest contribution of Sufism in terms of the ideological quest of India. Fine. So this is how you see the emergence of philosophies at different point of time and contributing in the various aspects of art and culture. Because Sufi saints were equally contributing in development of literature, language, songs, music, dance. So these all got promoted due to Sufi saints also. Fine. And if you go to, let's say, Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah or maybe Muddin Chasti Dargah, towards the evening, every day, you will find these qawwalis being performed over there, or the samas being performed over there. Fine. And you can have I mean, let's say the light glimpse of that Sufi ideas over there. All right. So these are the advantages of having this sort of philosophies in India. So Wahadatul Wujud was responsible in terms of promoting these ideas in India. Fine. That is about the philosophies of India contributing in the development of art and culture. So this chapter is completed now. Why? Because after this, the philosophies that you know in the context of, let's say, the social religious reform movement of modern India, freedom struggle, where we started talking about more about modernism, all right, rationalism, fine. So these things started coming up in Indian philosophy by through socialist reform movement. So that is different story altogether, which we'll discuss in modern India. But this is how philosophy of Indian has to be understood holistically. Fine. Now I'm completing today's class. If you have any question you can raise, then you can sum up the class. And then the next class we'll start with the same other chapter, in fact. Either it could be literature or painting, whatever. Fine. हाँ
हाँ
हाँ पूछिए.
सर आपने एक स्लाइड में इजोटेरिक लिखा हुआ था,
हाँ हाँ
तांत्रिसिज्म ही है वो?
नहीं. See, esoteric is an English word which says that any idea, language, literature, all right, any belief system which is not understood by the common people, which is understood only by a selected group of people, that will be called as esoteric. For example, Sanskrit. The Sanskrit was always an esoteric language. It is still. Suppose if someone starts talking to you in Sanskrit, would you be able to respond? No, because still it's an esoteric language. Very few people in India they speak Sanskrit. There are only a couple of villages in India which is known for speaking only Sanskrit. But rest of India does not even know about Sanskrit. हम लोग को पढ़ाया जाता था क्लास 7-8 तक, वो भी हम भूल गए अब. ठीक है, तो मुझे भी याद नहीं है संस्कृत कुछ भी. So that is esoteric basically. It is known only by few people who actually have been taught Sanskrit or rather who are still the learner of Sanskrit. All right, that is esoteric. Sanskrit is esoteric language in that way. Fine.
सर पाली और सर प्राकृत कब यूज किया? मैं सर
Prakrit was a language used by the common man. All right, so Prakrit was a language which is commonly spoken in India, North India especially. Fine. So, okay, then I'm concluding today's class. I think Nikhil sir has also a class right now. So, if you have any particular question, you can send me on WhatsApp a reply, or either I can reply on the next class that will be on Monday. Monday, I think Nikhil sir will be taking, and Tuesday I'll take the class. Fine. ठीक है, तो कोई क्वेश्चन हो तो आप WhatsApp से पूछ लीजिए, मैं बता दूंगा आपको. ठीक है. Let us conclude the class. Okay, fine. Thank you.